Hey guys, how's it going? It's me, Bo, back here on the Film Scene Investigation channel. Thank you so much for checking out this video. It's a new week, which means it's a new review, and today I'll be taking a closer look at the 2002 erotic drama, Secretary. So this is a movie that I've known about for many years. It's been on my watch list for a while now, and before watching it I decided to go online and just read some reviews, kind of get an idea of what it's about. And interestingly, the movie kept being referred to as a comedy, but having now seen the movie, I don't know if that was the intention of the filmmakers to make a comedy, but just seeing the dark nature of everything and how the story unfolded, I can assure you, this was not a comedy. Before we get into the review, guys, if you haven't already, please do consider subscribing to the channel. All the support is greatly appreciated. So, Secretary from 2002 was a movie directed by the filmmaker Steven Schoenberg and was based on the novel of the same name by the author Mary Gateskill. Now, this was a small production costing around about $4.5 million and was subsequently not a huge box office success, but the film did premiere at the Sundance Film Festival and was heavily praised by the critics. As for the story, it's centered around the lead character, Lee Holloway, who was played by actress Maggie Gyllenhaal. She was a young woman who had literally just come out of a mental institution after having a mental breakdown. She rejoined her family, and initially, she was happy to be back, with her loved ones. But it didn't take long for problems to arise. Her dad, who was played by actor Stephen McHattie, he basically was a drunk, an alcoholic who generally was just not a nice guy to be around. I mean, at one point we even saw the dad, hitting the mother and, these domestic arguments. Certainly not the ideal situation to be in when you're literally recovering from, a mental illness. You had to kind of feel a bit sad for Lee, seeing that she was a girl who was very vulnerable, very fragile, and just wanted to get back to some sort of normality, a normal family life. Yet when she returned, she has all this, domestic chaos all around her. Anyways, Lee saw all of this play out in front of her, and it brought back some bad memories. It almost triggered those mental issues that she was trying to deal with, and she ended up going back to her old ways, reverting to self-harm. Now, this was something that she didn't want to do. I mean, Lee knew that self-harm and, self-sabotage, it's only hurting herself, but it literally was a coping mechanism for her to, deal with the depression that she was feeling. During this time, Lee was encouraged to seek out new opportunities, maybe a job or something like that, something to occupy her time and to make a positive change in her life. Lee decided to take up a secretary course where she passed with flying colours and subsequently decided to apply for a job at a local law firm. Of course, Lee was nervous. It was a big step for her. There couldn't be no denying that. But she wanted to make a change, and this was the opportunity that she needed. So Lee travelled directly to the local law firm's office to hand in her CV in person, and this is where she met her future boss, E. Edward Gray, played by actor James Spader, a quietly intense man who clearly had his own personal baggage that he was dealing with. I mean, just from the way the character was introduced and just the way he acted or reacted to Lee coming into his office, he was like an oddball. You could clearly see that there was a lot of stuff going on in his head. Anyways, Lee handed in her CV, and given she had such a high pass mark, Gray decided to recruit her, even though he told her that she was overqualified. She began working and doing all of the standard mundane jobs that you would expect a secretary to do: booking appointments, taking calls, filing reports, all that boring stuff. But as I said, it was an outlet, a new opportunity for Lee, and well, she needed it. She needed this change in her life. It was quite obvious that when Lee started working, she was happy. She liked this new routine. But when it came to her boss, Edward Gray, he decided to put pressure on her, not make it easy, checking up on all of her work, checking her grammar, and I don't know, just generally being a pain. Gray was not a nice guy to be around. I mean, personally for me, I probably would have walked out of that job pretty quickly. But yeah, with Lee, this was her, opportunity that she wanted. And well, for her, she was like a deer in the headlights, She couldn't really say no or argue. She just wanted to keep the peace. So she just nodded along and agreed to work harder. I mean, it was kind of like mind games. At first she gave in a CV, and according to her boss, she was overqualified. And then suddenly she gets into the job and she's not good enough. Yeah, I mean, Edward Gray, he was clearly playing with Lee's emotions. And when these typing errors continued, well, this all led to the boss bringing Lee into his office for an explanation. He wanted to know why her work was so poor and why it wasn't up to standard, and eventually started to spank her. Now, this was where the story really kind of, I guess got interesting in a sense, because there was this guy who was physically abusing his employee because, her work wasn't good enough? It was like Gray was teaching his employee a lesson, of what to do and not what to do, and, using physical force in this very seedy, sexual manner. Gray obviously got some sort of sick satisfaction, with his domineering ways. And as for Lee, she was kind of stunned by her boss's actions. But what was interesting was, whereas most people in that situation would realize that that's a form of sexual assault, Lee, on the other hand, seemed to quite like this dominant behavior from her boss. These things continued, and well, what started out as a spanking session soon turned into a full-on BDSM sexual foreplay that was all carried out in office hours. I mean, aren't these guys supposed to be working? I mean, I don't know, like 1 minute Lee's there, kind of wide-eyed, bushy-tailed and kind of vulnerable, don't know what to expect. And then soon enough, she's on all fours, on a desk with a carrot in her mouth. I mean, wow. I guess in some ways you could describe what was happening to Lee as a sexual awakening of sorts. And all of this kind of actually improved her mental health. It was like Gray had unlocked these submissive desires that Lee had been carrying for all this time, as suddenly she had been liberated. And with all of this playing out, very quickly, Lee started to have these feelings for her boss, almost like she was falling in love with him. I mean, for her life had never been so good. She had all that history, all that baggage, a very trials and tribulations, all that issues of her mental health. And now suddenly she had a new job. She had a new man in her life, even though he wasn't directly in love with her. But you see, Lee's subservient behavior only ended up triggering Gray's internal issues that he was carrying himself. As I said earlier, E. Edward Gray was a complex man. He was a guy who, I guess, was sexually repressed, in his own way. And when Lee came into his life, it wasn't exactly an ideal situation for him. So, let's now talk about the darkest aspects of the film that I noticed. And that was that the filmmakers tried to gloss over the fact that Lee was a vulnerable young woman who was being taken advantage of. I mean, the power dynamics were clear from the very start as soon as Lee met her boss, E. Edward Gray. I mean, she was vulnerable, she was mentally fragile, and there was her boss, all domineering and, telling her what and what not to do. And so their sordid love affair began. And, it is what it is. But I think we should all remember here that Lee Holloway was a mentally unstable woman. Yes, she had overcome a lot, but she was still in recovery. And so she was vulnerable. And E. Edward Gray, her boss, knew that and still took advantage. He was subconsciously manipulating her, yet because she wasn't thinking straight, Lee thought in some way she was in control. Ultimately, Edward Gray was a scummy individual who, in other words, he was a sexual deviant who, took advantage where and when he could. But what we should also remind ourselves and not forget is that E. Edward Gray was a top lawyer. He was an attorney. So he wasn't some random guy off the street. No. This was a man with influence, a man with power. And he used that power for his own gains. There's no giving this guy the benefit of the doubt. I mean, he knew exactly what he was doing. He was strategic. And, let's face it, he should have known better to drag this poor innocent woman into his own sexual depravity. Anyways, these two got together and we saw how it unfolded. But what I found really eerie was how the filmmakers tried to portray Lee's sexual encounters as if they were liberating. This was some sort of romance, playing out before our very eyes. But I can assure you, it wasn't. I mean, you can kind of dress it up any way you want, but in reality, this was a mentally fragile woman who was being psychologically coerced by her boss to be his sex object. But what made it even worse was the fact that Lee was mentally unstable. So she was not in the right mind to fully consent to all the things that her boss wanted her to do. Taking all of that into account, and looking at it from, that perspective, this 2002 drama, it's a shady piece of cinema because ultimately it borders on propaganda where the filmmakers have purposely misrepresented the situation to the audience. I can totally see how women may watch this film and like it for its kinky perspective, but if we're going to apply logic and common sense here, E. Edward Gray was a predator. Lee Holloway was a sexually abused victim, and this was not a love story by any stretch of the imagination. Moving on from that, there were also themes of self-harm that the film explored, with Lee having this box of sharp instruments and occasionally using them to, hurt herself. There wasn't any real kind of graphic imagery of the self-harm. It was kind of heavily alluded to, but still, it was there. It happened. It does happen to, thousands and thousands of people who suffer from mental health, and it's a shame, but at least in that sense, it wasn't glossed over. When it comes to the performances, I thought Maggie Gyllenhaal did a wonderful job playing Lee Holloway, this young woman who was taken in by her boss. Her character really went on a journey, starting out as this vulnerable, kind of shy, timid young woman to, towards the end of the film, becoming a very sexually provocative woman, delving into all these very extreme BDSM foreplay situations. I mean, there's no denying that Maggie Gyllenhaal carried this movie, and if it wasn't for her, I don't think it would have been as interesting. So, credit where credit's due. And I'll be honest and say here that I've never really been a fan of Maggie Gyllenhaal. Now, I can say that yes, she's competent, she's solid, but have I really seen any kind of amazing performances from her? Not really. Now, listen, I've not seen her whole filmography, so, take it for what it is. But from the films that I have seen her in, she's been okay, but nothing special. But with Secretary, this is absolutely the best performance I've seen her deliver. And so looking back and seeing how the actress was praised all those years ago during the time of its release, hey, it totally makes sense. As for her counterpart, James Spader, I thought he was perfectly cast to play the manipulative lawyer, E. Edward Grey, whose controlling behaviour really was there to mask his own inner turmoil. While he was approachable on the outside, well, underneath, he was a twisted man with these weird sexual fantasies, and he really liked mistreating others. For many years, James Spader has played many sexually repressed characters, throughout his career, and with The Secretary, that was no different. Now, I've seen many of James Spader's films in the past. I've even reviewed a few on this channel. So going into this film, I expected him to deliver, a good performance, and he certainly did that. With a story like this, it's so crucial to make sure that the cast have great chemistry, since the story really relies on them. And when it came to Maggie Gyllenhaal and James Spader, they worked perfectly together. It was great casting. So credit to the casting agent for getting that right. If the chemistry had not have been there between the two, well, it just would not have worked. And I think that would have been pretty clear from the get-go before the film was even released. I mean, from rehearsals and all that kind of stuff, you know if it's going to work or not. And with these two, it worked. So, dislikes for Secretary from 2002. When it comes to dislikes, there wasn't really anything that really stuck out to me as a major negative, but I can't say I was too fond of the scene where we saw Lee running back to the office in her wedding dress. So in terms of the context, Lee had been fired by her boss. She then decided to get married to this on-off boyfriend that she had. But when it came to the actual wedding day, she realized that she couldn't go through with it and decided to run back to the office and declare her love to her boss. Now, in terms of the storytelling, no issue with that. I thought I kind of expect that to happen, and for there to be this kind of declaration of love. So yeah, that's not an issue, but it was the execution specifically that I had a problem with. Seeing Lee run across this field in her wedding dress while this acoustic little jingle played out, tonally, it was just off. I mean, it was something that you would see in a romantic comedy. And yeah, I mean, it just didn't click right with me. It just felt really off. And because by all means, this was not a romantic comedy. I mean, this isn't 10 Things I Hate About You or, whatever else you can think of. I mean, this was very dark, and it just seemed a bit strange towards the end of the film, the filmmakers try and lighten the mood. I mean, as I said, it wasn't a big thing, but just going back to when I was watching the film for the first time and that scene came up, it just seemed really kind of strange. I was like, oh my God, I'm hoping this isn't going to get really kind of soppy right now. And luckily it didn't, but yeah, that was a little strange for me. I also felt that the film, the longer it went on, did start to drag. At the beginning, I thought the film overall had a good pace. We were kind of getting introduced to Lee and then her family, and then she quickly applied for this job. We met E. Edward Grey, and so forth and so on. But yeah, towards the end, I did start to kind of question where the story was going. The pace just kind of slowed, and listen, I appreciate this was adapted from a book, so of course the filmmakers are trying to hit every beat and trying to cram it all in, but I don't know, maybe a more condensed screenplay would have been beneficial overall to the viewing experience. And so, ratings for Secretary from 2002. Taking everything into account, I'm going to be rating this movie a 3.9 out of 10. Secretary from 2002 was an interesting story about a woman who got entangled with her boss, a man who was, a sexual predator. Now, the filmmakers tried to portray this as some sort of quirky love story, and they tried to go against the typical conventions of a romantic comedy. I mean, look, ultimately, guys, behind all of that, this was a dominant, submissive relationship that was being presented as empowering rather than exploitative. I can only remind myself that this movie was released back in a time when mental health wasn't as prevalent in the public eye as it is now. And also people like Harvey Weinstein were still very much in power. Would a movie like this be made now? Yes, I do think so, but I just think, with the whole Me Too movement and all that kind of thing, and women's rights and all this kind of stuff, I just don't see how this story could be depicted now, really, in the current climate that we live in. Ultimately, this is a story about a young woman who gets taken advantage of, yet because she's not fully there, like mentally, she the whole time thinks that she's the one manipulating her boss, which is not the case. So yeah, just a kind of a strange film, to say the least. If you've seen The Secretary, then please let me know your thoughts and memories in the comment section below. For all those out there who have not seen it, I would give this a minor recommendation. It's not a bad film, and I think once you know and see what's going on, you kind of pick apart the subversion. That's quite interesting. But ultimately, this wasn't a film that really dealt with visuals, and yeah, the score was okay, but it wasn't anything really that interesting. So I don't know, would I watch this movie again? Probably not. And well, that's all from me today, guys. I do hope you've enjoyed this review of Secretary from 2002. I'll be back, of course, next week with another film review. If you haven't already, guys, please do consider subscribing to the channel. It really means a lot. And of course, guys, take care.